Are you ready for some real chills? In this series, we'll be exploring a collection of genuine accounts of the paranormal. These are chilling stories shared by people who have personally encountered unexplained phenomena. Story 1. Posted by Soon-to-be Stardust. Gosh, let's see if I can recall it correctly. There was a body of a fairly large person, once found in the woods. They were quickly killed, and there was nothing extremely off about the scene, except he had half of his pointer, ring, and pinky finger all missing from his left hand. No one could find the missing fingers, and they never found any clues. A few weeks later, another body was found, another man who was a bit smaller than the previous guy. Same situation, quickly killed, and 3 fingers missing all from the left hand, and still no clues. A few more weeks went by, and this time it was a woman who was found, smaller than the second guy found, with the same fingers missing from the same hand. This went on for a while, with the victims getting smaller and smaller, until it was the kids' bodies being found. One teenager's body, though, only had the ring finger and pinky finger removed. The police found a fingerprint at this crime scene, and they found it matched the prints from a theft record from the previous victim. The guy telling the story then told the kids that the killer was searching to replace his fingers, and so far, he had yet to see if the fingers of children their age would fit. He then took off his glove, showing he had a scarred pointer finger, and was missing half his ring and pinky finger, and then lunged at the kids while screaming. He later told the kids he lost the 2 in a work accident, and doctors were able to save his very mangled pointer finger. He told this story every year at camp. Story 2. Posted by Forklift Driver. I've posted this before. One year, a group of us went camping in Kearney, Ontario, where we always go camping. Whenever we go, we always form our tents in a big circle, with the fire pit in the middle of us. We've been drinking, smoking a few joints, and a few of us were tripping balls on shrooms. The first night we were there, this guy randomly walks into our circle, introduces himself. I can't remember the name he gave, that he was in the military and decided to take some vacation to camp out a bit. He asked if he could join our fire, as it was getting late and he didn't buy any firewood. Being the friendly stone people we are, we let him join our fire. He even pitched in some money for the firewood. The night went on and we all were having a good time. One by one, our group started heading off to bed, me being either the second or third. I remember waking up to the sound of someone talking and the fire being started. It was 4 in the morning. I peeped out my tent and saw the random person just sitting on a log by the fire, talking to himself. Still tripping on shrooms, I thought to myself I am in no condition to deal with this and chalked it up to me just tripping out. I wake up the next day and everyone is still alive, thankfully, and the fire is smoldering. We looked to the next campsite, where the random was staying, and it was spotless, no garbage, no tracks in the trail around the site, no nothing. We all started talking about him, just to be sure we all saw him. Through talking, we managed to figure out that he must not have slept at all. The last 2 of our group passed out just after 3:30 a.m. The first person got up just after 6 a.m. and noticed he was gone. The rest of the camping trip went well and we all went home. Fast forward maybe 4 to 5 years, I flip on the news and there is a picture of someone I could swear I recognize. He was arrested for a bunch of crimes, including rape and murder. Guess who it was? It was the random guy who joined our fire. I don't know why I remembered his face, but I guess it was just a weird situation where my brain right-clicked and saved as a JPEG in my brain. Now, I have no way of proving if it was the same guy. We didn't take any pictures of the random fire, but the picture jump-started my memory and made me instantly remember the weird random fire joiner. Either that, or they looked identical to the same person. Story 3. Posted by Plyvoy. I remember one that one of my Cub Scout leaders told us on a campout when I was Prob 7. It took place during pioneer times. A man and his wife traveled west in hopes of either striking it rich with gold, or at worst, finding a nice plot of land to settle down on and farm. Manifest destiny and whatnot. A few months into their journey they come across just the spot. A beautiful plot of land to make their new home. Winter would be coming in a couple months, so they build a hasty shack and figure they'll hunker down there for the winter, and build a more established house in a few months when the weather is more permitting. They don't worry, as the area is teeming with wildlife for hunting and trapping, so they figure they'll be set for food. A couple of months go by and the winter is bitter cold and unrelenting. They've finished off the last of their food stash, and they haven't seen so much as a squirrel in weeks. They're both slowly starving and freezing to death as they huddle in their shack, day after day with no end in sight. The man's wife is delirious with hunger. Fearing that they will soon be dead, he decides to go for a hunt. He musters the energy to bundle up and heads out determined to stay out as long as it takes to find them both some food. A couple of days pass as the man takes shelter under impromptu stick shelters, keeping warm with a campfire in the night time and hunting in the daytime. Nearly frozen to death, mercifully the man spots a beautifully plump rabbit several yards away. He takes aim with his musket and bang. It's a perfect shot. With a newfound energy the man runs home, giddy to finally feast with his wife. What he doesn't know is that while he was gone, his wife had discovered some tasty flesh of her own. Literally. The hunger had driven her insane, causing her to believe that her now frostbitten fingertips were ladyfinger cookies. She started off with a few nibbles here and there, slowly pulling the flesh away from her bones. After just a couple of hours both hands were nothing but bone. So she worked her way up her arms to the elbow. The feeling of something in her stomach just continued to drive her further, until she had chewed away at every last bit of skin she could reach, culminating in her chewing off her own lips. The husband approached the shack with his, now frozen, kill when he got an uneasy feeling. Fearing the worst, he steps up to the door and slowly opens it, expecting to see his wife's corpse shriveled on the floor. But instead what he finds is even worse. This zombie-like creature with exposed teeth and bones writhing on the floor at the sight of him, chomping its jaws with an insatiable hunger. At that point, one of the scouts screeched for the leader to stop, which I was extremely thankful for, as it was easily the most terrifying thing I had ever heard at the age of 7. The scout leader told it with real conviction too. Honestly, still gives me the creeps if I go camping and happen to think about it sitting around a fire. Story 4. Posted by Shadow. There was a Brit who was driving through Ireland as the weather got progressively worse and day soon turned to night. He suddenly realized that he was on the wrong road, but there was nowhere to turn around, so he pressed on, barely able to see the road through the rain. Without warning, his car just died. No battery, no engine. He assumed water must have shorted something and he'd best start walking. He was soaking wet 100 yards, but he continued walking. An hour later, he heard a noise behind him and turned to see a car coming very slowly up the road behind him, its lights very dim. As it reaches him, he reaches out through the torrential rain and opens the back door and jumps in. Shocked, he is the only person in the car. There is no one driving and no other passengers. He freezes with fear as the car slowly continues up the road through the pouring rain. Before long, a village comes into view and the car creeps silently and slowly into the village. The Brit spies a pub, so he jumps out and runs inside, not looking back. Painting with horror, he orders a beer and sits down. A minute later, 2 soaking wet Irishmen come into the pub. The taller one points at the Brit and says, "That's him, Paddy. That's the bastard I saw jump out of the car we were pushing." Story 5. Posted by Birds with Teeth. The Golden Arm, or at least the version my mom tells me about. A fellow is looking to be married to one of the rich merchant's daughters to gain the fortune that would come with her. Fortunately, the merchant had an unmarried daughter still, so the fellow began to court her. The first thing he noticed is that she had a solid gold right arm. She apparently lost it in a childhood accident, and her father had a golden arm forged for her. Seeing this as a sign of extreme wealth, he continued courting her, making her believe he truly loved her and not for her father's money. In turn, she fell deeply in love with him. They get married and the fellow is given his riches along with part of the merchant business his now father-in-law owned, thus giving him more money. However, he soon realized his wife was now of no real use, so he ignored her, gave her gifts and had dinner with her, but the love he said he felt had disappeared. Angry and heartbroken, the daughter accused him of marrying her for her money, in which he boldly states of course. She was furious, screaming about going to tell her father what a scoundrel he truly was and their riches would be stripped away along with his job. This angered the fellow. After all he worked so hard to get to here, he wasn't going to let her take it away. So he pushed her down the cellar stairs and let her snap her neck on the stone. He pleaded heartbroken to the grief-stricken father, losing his most favorite daughter, the fellow's riches intact. The fellow and family hold a funeral for the daughter and weep and cry. When it was him and his dead wife, he opened the casket and pulled out a saw, for she did not need her golden arm in the grave. That night he slept with the arm under his pillow, not wanting even the servants to see it before he melted it down into bars. He slept soundly until a voice like the wind asks, "Where's my golden arm?" Slow and far away the voice echoed through the sleeping house, so quiet he thought it was just a draft. Until the voice came again, closer and louder this time, as it down the hall. "Where's my golden arm?" Sitting up, the fellow looked around fearfully, too scared to do anything as he hears again much closer. "Where's my golden arm?" He felt a heat on his back and a movement from under his pillow, but he was too scared to look away from the door as he hears again, just outside the frame, the wail of, "Where's my golden arm?" It felt like hellfire on his back as he felt the hot metal of the hand on his back, seemingly crawling on its own as he watched the doorknob turn. The maid found his body that morning, face frozen in horror and hair bright white, hands still clutching the sheets around his body. But the strangest thing was that his dead wife's golden arm was on his chest, hand wrapped tightly around his throat. Sorry this is long, but this is the first time I've written this story out. It's always been verbally told. Story 6. Posted by Breck2501. There were a couple that were, as far as I know, unique to the church Camp Galamaxon, I went to as a kid. Though I admit it's possible some of our stories were ubiquitous ones just adapted to the place. I don't really know. One of them, though, I do have first-hand knowledge about. It's the story of Sydney. The camp was established on an old piece of property that has been a lot of different things over the years. Back during the war, it was a girls' boarding school. One girl who was there was deeply in love with a boy who had gone off to fight. They exchanged letters constantly, until one day the letters stopped coming. Few weeks later, she gets word that her beloved was killed in action. She was so distraught that she hanged herself in her dorm room. There's still a plaque by the door of the room in her memory. Now, I know for a fact that the room is haunted. I stayed in that room for 1 year when I worked for the camp. One night after lights out, the fan came on by itself. It started spinning faster and faster until it started wobbling really hard, acting like it's about to fall off. I knew the stories, so I shouted, "Stop it, Sydney! I'm a friend!" Fan immediately stopped. Not just slowed down and came to an eventual stop. It's like someone grabbed the fan blades and stopped it. Story 7. Posted by Hand-Eating Cat. Writing this out simply for the sake of having it written because I cannot find a single reference to it anywhere online, and it scared the absolute shit out of me when I was a 12-year-old Boy Scout. As told by a counselor. When my uncle attended university in the early 80s, he was among a group of fraternity brothers responsible for recruiting freshmen, who went through a particular kind of hazing, involving a supposed haunted house a few miles from campus. An old 3-story Victorian-style mansion left abandoned and withering away to the elements after, rumor has it, the father of the family that resided within had one day gone mad and murdered his wife and 3 children with a hatchet and then hung himself from the second-story stairwell. The hazing involved sending 3 freshman potential fraternity recruits to said house at 3 a.m., 2 equipped with a unique item relating to the murders and all 3 with a candle and a match. The freshmen would be sent one at a time to the house, observed from afar by the frat boys. They were instructed to enter the house, light their candle, and ascend each floor until they got to the attic. They were told to stop at each main picture window of each floor and let their candles show in the window, to prove they were actually there and completing the challenge. My uncle was a senior member of the fraternity, and he ended up having a worse outcome than anyone else involved. So the night comes, the fateful night that changed multiple people's lives irreversibly, forever. My uncle, 4 of his frat brothers and 3 freshman potential frat brothers arrive at a small bridge on the outskirts of the house around 2:30 a.m. The night is cold and still, clouds ride across an almost full moon, illuminating the old house and casting eerie shadows. The 3 freshmen are given separate items alongside their candles and matches. The first gets a hatchet, representing the murder weapon. The second is given a rope, representing the suicide method. The third is given a second match, because he's told it's almost certain his candle will not burn true after the first 2 ascend the stairs and disturb the spirits. So my uncle, the frat brothers, and the other 2 freshmen watch as the first recruit approaches the old house with a hatchet, a candle, and a match in hand. Nervously, he enters, and in the dark night the rest can plainly see the match strike, light, and ignite the candle. This house had many large picture windows, and the whole group watches as a glow illuminates the first floor windows, passing one by one, until the stairs, when it begins to rise, first floor, second floor, and then the candle goes out. They spectate for a minute, most likely a draft, or moving too fast from panic. So they send the second freshman recruit, equipped with a rope, candle and match. And eerily enough, the same events unfold. First floor, second floor, and the candle goes out. The third and last recruit is obviously shaken, but the frat brothers try to rationalize the situation by explaining that the other 2 recruits are probably just messing with them. Hold up to the second floor, laughing in the dark and sipping on a hip flask. My uncle says he didn't believe this, but he just laughed and agreed to ease the tension. So they send the third freshman to investigate, give his buddies a kick in the ass and remind them that they can't join the frat unless they make it to the attic and prove it with the candle glowing in the window. With nothing but a candle and 2 matches, the third visibly trembling freshman approaches the house, gives an apprehensive look back to the group, then enters. Again, it happens, the same thing, first floor, second floor, and the candle goes out. It doesn't relight, despite the second match. My uncle and his buddies are perplexed. Do these guys just not want to join the frat? Are they just screwing with them to be cocky or prove something? It's got to be freezing, dark and miserable in that old house. What do they have to gain? So they wait. And wait. 2 hours have passed, the beer has all been drunk and my uncle and his frat buddies are just annoyed at this point. So they say fuck it, leave them, let the freshmen enjoy their little prank and sit in the cold and dark, not going to give them the satisfaction. So they go back to the dorm and sleep it off, eager to see the freshman recruits the next day and inform them that they failed the test and hope it was worth it. But the freshmen never showed up. In fact, they still haven't shown up the next day either. Nervous, my uncle and his buddies decide to investigate the old house before getting police involved and potentially a massive scandal. Well, what they found, my uncle never forgot or forgave himself. At the top of the second floor stairway, they found the first freshman, face down in a pool of blood with the hatchet buried in his head. Hanging by the rope he brought was the second freshman, dangling from the second floor railing. Panicked and horrified, they called the police. The third freshman was never found, but there were footprints in the dust leading up the stairs, and out an open window. The police never found him, and he is believed to be the top suspect. Why would he kill his friends? No known motive. but he's the only suspect and is still missing to this day. After an extensive investigation, no charges are filed on the frat or my uncle due to lack of evidence. My uncle's fraternity completely disbanded after the incident. Hazing gone wrong ends in 2 grisly deaths, the papers said, a big mess swept under the rug. But then the incidents started happening. Now here's the even more peculiar part of the whole mess. Each year, almost on the dot, the night of the deaths of those 2 freshmen, my uncle's frat brothers started dropping like flies, one at a time. Grief-stricken suicide, alcoholism, tragic accident. Each was explained away and forgotten. Only my uncle seemed to draw the connection, and it haunted him for the rest of his life. Until he was the last one left. 12 years later, he found himself the last of his fraternity to be alive, and the anniversary was approaching. Terrified, he panicked, sold all his worldly possessions and decided to live the vagrant rail-riding hobo lifestyle. Who knows why? We certainly don't. All we know is how he was found, 2 days after the anniversary. He was found at a railway station by a worker unloading boxcars. He was found alone, dead and cold, a horrible shocked look frozen on his face. Beside him was a candle and 2 burn-out matches, and scratched into the door of the boxcar was... Ah! That's when you scream and scare the ever-loving shit out of a bunch of 12-year-old Boy Scouts, and have them hike in the dark back to their camp. Good times. Story 8. Posted by Perilous Platypus. My father was a man of extensive creative talents, prone to the odd tale of whimsy and horror, as the mood might take him. I recall one story in particular, seared into my memory, and piercing the veil of time to visit me on occasion even now. It spoke of a civilization that hung on the precipice. How the city teetered on the edge of disaster, the waves of destruction crashing into the shoals beneath the cliff it resided upon. All of the people in this civilization saw the threat, were fully aware of the impending doom, but they did nothing to halt its progress. The challenge resided in their need to rely upon each other, to place the concerns of the future above the trivial but more immediate desires of the present. They consoled themselves by protesting that the city upon the cliff had stood for generations, and it had never fallen into the sea. Surely it would last for a generation longer. There was no need to change their behavior now, with history being so eloquent an excuse to continue as they had. And so they built as those who had come before them had built. The buildings grew higher. The wells bored deeper. The people and their things became ever more numerous. Each person added the merest feather to the load, and each believed their feather could surely not be responsible for any consequences. It was but a feather. A feather would not break the earth, could not be the final burden which broke the soil beneath the city and caused it to tumble into the sea. Besides, why should they give up their feathers if others did not? And so each person lived as they desired, heedless of the cracks slowly winding their way up the pavement. Careless of the small quakes, they rumbled beneath. They paid no mind to these inconvenient harbingers, for there were things to build, desires to fulfill, dreams to live that could not be forestalled in favor of imagined nightmares far off. The city grew and grew, each living for themselves. A great collection of individuals, but not a society. A civilization of humans without humanity. Feather upon feather was added. Then came the final feather. A great groan sounded out, and the world began to tilt and shift. Screeching pierced the night as the tip of the cliff sheared off, dooming the city on the hill to the death of the sea below. In the briefest of moments, the project of generations was reduced to ruins, and a great future of possibility was lost. I called out to my father, wondering why the people would fail to heed the warnings, wondering why they would give up so much in service of so little. He leaned forward and laid a hand on my shoulder, his eyes sad and distant, and he whispered, "That, my child, is the way people are." Story 9. Posted by Black Sick. It's pretty simple and I will not drag it out. So here it goes. One day my neighbor walked over into my backyard while I was in my garden. He looked disheveled and was wearing pajamas. When I stood up I noticed his eyes were sunken in, and it looked as if he lost a lot of weight. I tried to crack a joke about how this would be a great day to go down to the beach if it were not for the weather being so cold. But the joke fell flat. A week later I bumped into his wife at the post office. She was in line in front of me, mailing about a dozen packages. I asked if her husband was feeling better because he looked a bit under the weather last week when he was in my backyard. She tells me I must have been mistaken. He passed away over a month ago from cancer. The packages she was mailing were his action figure toy collection she sold online. I was speechless. Was I crazy? Maybe I did misjudge the weekend I thought I saw him. Then I really thought hard. I did not remember him saying anything to me. I did remember telling him the joke and it falling flat. I assumed I wasn't funny and that's why he didn't laugh. Or maybe he couldn't because it may have been just his spirit. When I returned home from the post office I immediately started telling my wife about our neighbor. Before I could get out he had passed away from cancer, she said. Oh yeah, I saw you guys talking last weekend. And then I tell her about seeing his wife at the post office and being told about his passing. So we go to our security camera and play back the video from the week before. It's clear in the video that I do stand up. It's obvious I'm acknowledging the presence of someone and have a brief conversation. And then I go back to tending to my garden. But on the video the entire time I was the only person in my backyard. Story 10. Posted by Garuda Star. Why I'm no longer a park ranger. When I was a park ranger, I usually worked the day shift, but there had lately been a lot of night shift guys quitting. It was obviously inevitable that I would be asked to do a night shift. I arrived at the watchtower at 5 p.m. The watchtower was next to one of those large ponds/small lakes. I climbed up the stairs to the top and entered the tower room. There was one clear glass wall and 3 wooden opaque walls. Inside was a bed with a nightstand next to it on the right. There was also a kitchenette with 2 sets of cabinets on the left-hand side. Next to the glass wall on the far side of the room was a radio communication station. On the nightstand was a flashlight. Inside the nightstand were a pair of binoculars and a long-range walkie-talkie. Inside the small cabinets was food. I couldn't open the big cabinets for some reason. There was most likely stuff in there that was above my pay grade. Around the watchtower room was a walkway. Anyways, I went to the communication station and radioed my partner Donnie, who was at the main ranger station. I said, "Well, Donnie, it looks like it's just us tonight." He didn't reply though, so I assumed he was in the bathroom. So I took the binoculars and walkie-talkie and stepped onto the walkway. I scanned the far ridge, the roads, and the forest below. I was looking for illegal campsites, troublemakers, and other riff-raff. As I passed my binoculars across the far ridge, I saw what looked like a snowman. I had a double take and thought, a snowman? In the middle of July? I looked again and saw that it wasn't a snowman but a kid wearing a ghost costume, just staring at the watchtower. The costume was a sheet pulled over with 2 eye holes cut out, like the ghost costumes in Charlie Brown. So I radioed Donnie again and asked, "Hey Donnie, are you there?" Donnie responded, "Yeah, I just made it out." I got a chuckle out of that. Donnie was always good for a laugh. I then said, "Yeah. Say, can you check out the ridge? I saw a kid up there wearing a ghost costume. You know, a sheet with eye holes cut out." "You mean like from Charlie Brown Halloween?" he asked. "Yes." Donnie then left the ranger station and headed for the ridge. About 40 minutes later, the sun had set and it was a bit dark. I scanned the ridge again, but the kid in the ghost costume was gone. So I radioed Donnie again. "Are you there?" Donnie responded, "I'm almost at the ridge." "What's up?" I said. "You might want to search the surrounding area. The kid has moved." "Sure thing." About 10 minutes later, I saw Donnie's flashlight shining on the ridge in the distance. I looked in my binoculars and saw Donnie shining the light around and Donnie shrugging. He then radioed me and said, "I don't see anyone, H." Donnie's flashlight then went out and there was just static on the radio. I spoke into the radio. "Donnie? Donnie? Donnie! Are you there? What happened?" Just then I heard a loud shriek coming from the base of the tower. I shined my flashlight down and saw, right between the tower and the pond, a pale, blue woman with empty eye sockets staring at me. All of her limbs looked broken and bent in the wrong way. Just then she started sprinting up the stairs towards the top where I was. I had never seen anyone move that fast. She was running faster than Olympic runners. I freaked out, ran inside, grabbed the biggest kitchen knife I could find, locked the door, and hid next to it. There was no way she could run up those steps that fast, even if her limbs weren't broken. Then I heard the sound of one of the big cabinets opening. My blood ran cold. I slowly looked over at the cabinets to see one of the big ones wide open with the ghost from the ridge looking right at me. I froze in fear, that is until I heard it giggling. I recognized that giggle. I pulled off the sheet and saw it was one of Donnie's kids. He pulled out a walkie-talkie and said, "Hey Dad, we got him." I heard Donnie's voice come over the radio. "Ha ha ha, good job." I grabbed that walkie-talkie and said, "Ha ha, very funny you jerk." Donnie replied, "Yeah, listening to you scream like a girl was the best bit." I responded, "Yes, screw you too, Donnie." By the way, it wasn't me who screamed, it was that zombie chick at the stairs. "Who was that, your wife?" Donnie hesitated in responding and just stuttered out, "And my wife? Do ghosts look like zombies from that distance? You said it yourself, it looked like a Charlie Brown ghost." I then said, "Not the ghosts. There was a woman at the bottom of the tower." She shrieked and ran up the stairs faster than an Olympic runner. Donnie then said, Yeah. I didn't put a woman on the stairs. Needless to say, I put in my resignation when my shift was over." Story 11. Posted by Orion Pax. I don't know if this will be seen, but hoping one or two people see this. For starters, our house is from the 1800s and we've been renovating it for the last 3.5 years, and we've heard that a previous owner died here. One night I was coming downstairs to get a glass of water when I saw a white figure floating about an inch off the ceiling, which is 8 feet tall. I was a little shaken up, and I ran upstairs and back to bed. About a year later, my parents bought a camper with a built-in radio. After about 2 months of having the camper, the radio in it mysteriously turned on. My dad heard it, and then turned it off. Then a few days later, the radio turned back on, and the cycle repeated until the battery died. After a year after the radio kept going off, I had finally moved into my bedroom after it was finished. One night I was watching YouTube, and I heard a shushing noise when all of my family was asleep. I heard the shushing noise a few times after that. The last thing that had happened was in July. I was on a FaceTime call with one of my friends, and I was fidgeting with some coins I had. I stood one up on its edge, and was going to stand another one up, but I'd fallen too many times, so I gave up and swiped it onto the floor. After that I went downstairs to refill my water bottle because my mouth was dry from talking. I go back upstairs. About 5 minutes later I went back upstairs to find the coin that was on the floor back on my desk standing on its edge. I went downstairs and asked if anyone had gone up to my room, and everybody said no, so I went back up to my room and heard that same shushing sound. Now one of my best friends has been telling me that he's been hearing a shushing sound occasionally when he's home alone. Story 12. Posted by Ray Rambles. I've been telling this one since I was little. I love it. I hope you enjoy it. It's not super scary, but it's nice and spooky, so hopefully you'll still like it. I work in the Nevada desert. A little facility out in the middle of nowhere. To get home it's about an hour drive of pretty much nothing. One day driving home, my car ran out of gas. I've always wondered if this dreaded day would come, and here we are. I had no choice but to start walking. I always drove past this little roadside motel, so I guess I don't have much of a choice. I walked a couple miles until I got to it. I asked the front desk if they had any gas I could use. They said yes, but it would cost me. It was way too expensive. I didn't even have enough on me, so I had no choice but to clean dishes and do other odd jobs around the place for the rest of the night. By the end I had made enough money, but I was completely beat. No way I could drive after that. I asked if I could at least use a room for the night. Not wanting to cause an accident, the owner said yes. Thank God. Although what he said afterwards surprised me, to say the least. We have 2 rooms available. One is haunted, and there's another next to it. I laughed it off, figuring it was just him messing with me after the long day. Friendly jokes. Just to be safe, I chose the room next to it. When I got in there, what a dump. Just a shitty table with a shitty bed and a shitty broken fridge. I sat down on the bed, exhausted. I looked up to see there was a hole in the wall, about the size of a coin. Wow. How classy. Out of curiosity, I looked through the hole with one eye. I saw the room next to mine. At the table, a young woman was seated, brushing her long brown hair. She was beautiful, from the back at least. I didn't want to be a creep, so I just went to bed. A couple hours later I woke up with an uncomfortable feeling. Just in the pit of my stomach that something wasn't quite right. I sat up and saw the hole in the wall was now glowing. I kneeled back down to it and peered through. All I could see was red. Bright, glowing red. I figured the woman had just placed something, I don't know, an electronic in front of the hole. I went back to bed, unable to shake the feeling. The next morning when I woke up, I headed straight to the front desk to get all paid so I could get the hell out. As I got the gas, I decided to ask the owner. Hey, that woman in the room next to mine. Is she alright? I was getting kind of a bad feeling. The owner laughed at me. Oh, so you saw her. She's the haunted room's resident. I laughed it off again, trying to continue to joke around with sarcasm. Well, she's awfully pretty for a ghost. The owner handed me the gas tank. Then you haven't seen her from the front. Her eyes are glowing red. Story 13. Posted by Unknown. It was a cold, dreary night, with misting rains and a chilling breeze. Me and my uncle were coming back from visiting our cousin who lived upstate. With another 20 miles to get home, we pulled off the interstate and started down a rural stretch of highway that led to our small town. Just off the edge of the interstate exit ramp, we saw a man, standing in the cold rain with a bag over his shoulder and his thumb out, trying to hitch a ride. My uncle pointed the man out. Look at that poor son of a bitch. I looked at my uncle. Should we give him a ride? My uncle shrugged his shoulders. I pulled the car to the side and the man jogged up to our window. Where are you headed, buddy? Elmdale, the man said. Elmdale was a tiny town about 15 miles up the highway. Most of the town died out after the Great Depression. There wasn't much left but a few scattered houses and the county cemetery. We agreed to give the man a ride, and he climbed into the back seat of our car. My uncle and I were both pretty tired, so we didn't try to make conversation. We just drove in silence. That is, until we heard giggling in the back seat. We looked in the rear-view mirror. The hitchhiker had his bag, a green canvas army surplus style pack, opened up. We couldn't see what was inside, but he was staring into it with a big smile on his face. He whispered into the bag, I know, soon enough they'll see. And then he giggled again. By this time he notices we are looking in the rear-view mirror at him. He hastily closes the bag and looks out the window like nothing happened. My uncle asks, Hey buddy, what's in the bag? The hitchhiker gets an enraged look on his face. None of your damned business. Me and my uncle exchange glances. Maybe this was a bad idea. A ride in silence for a few more miles. I speed up to try and get to Elmdale faster so we can get this creep out of our car. Then we hear the whispering again. "Close now, darling, won't be long. Be ready when the time comes." Again we see that he's got his bag open and is talking down into it. I clear my throat and say, "Do you have a pet in that bag or something?" The hitchhiker looks bewildered. "A pet?" He starts looking around the car. "No, I mean in your bag. What's in your bag?" The hitchhiker stares defiantly back at me in the rear view mirror. "None of your damned business." I push the gas pedal down further. Up ahead, through the rain, I can see the edge of the county cemetery coming into view. We are close. The hitchhiker starts laughing. It's a maniacal laugh, like the kind you'd hear echoing down the hall of a psych ward. He's got his bag open, staring down inside. I hear my uncle say, "Fuck this," and it's all the encouragement I need. I brake hard and pull the car roughly onto the shoulder. We are just outside the cemetery gates. I throw the transmission in park and yell, "Get the fuck out of the car!" My uncle springs from his seat. In a second he's out his door and ripping open the rear passenger door. He grabs the hitchhiker and yanks him out. The hitchhiker shrieks and pulls a box cutter from his jacket. Just as he extends the blade, my uncle punches him in the jaw. The hitchhiker stumbles back and takes a hard fall into a seated position. Instantly my uncle and I are back in the car. I throw the transmission in drive and floor it. We pull away and in the rear view I can see the hitchhiker. He's spinning in the road, slashing air with his box cutter, shrieking at the top of his lungs. In a matter of seconds he fades from view. The car is up to speed and he is long gone. In the confusion my uncle wasn't able to close the rear door. The momentum has partially pressed it closed but it rattles, slightly ajar. My uncle reaches over the seat to pull it shut. "Oh shit," he says. "What?" "He left his bag in the back seat." We exchange glances as he pulls the bag into the front seat. Hesitantly he pulls the flap open, his hand freezes in place, his eyes bulge. "Holy shit!" I ask him what it is but he's unable to speak. Instead he turns the bag toward me and pulls the flap all the way open so that I finally peer inside. And do you know what was in that bag? None of your damned business. Story 14. Posted by Flips76. Gotta apologize if I don't do it justice. I only heard it told once years back. We were on a scout trip in northern Utah. Was a short trip with some light hiking, fishing, merit badge work, etc. According to the scout leader, the place was called Mirror Lake, and he had an old friend who'd camped out there before, some 25 years before. This friend was there with two other guys, all in their mid-20s. I can't remember the names, so we'll say they were Steve, Mike, and Jacob. They had a very tame fishing trip, no alcohol or any other substance that could have upped the chances that events were being misremembered, misinterpreted, scary when it wasn't, etc. But on the final night of the trip, they'd called it a night, settled in for bed, and Steve fell asleep. Not long later, he and Mike woke up in the tent, to a noise in the distance, presumably an animal echoing from across the lake. As they came to, they noticed Jacob was missing. At first, they didn't assume anything was wrong. He was probably just going to the bathroom, and would be back any minute. But as they waited, they gradually got more uneasy and worried. Eventually they decided to go find him. As they were just beginning their search of the near area, but before they started calling his name out as loud as they could, they heard an ear-splitting, inhuman screech, followed by Jacob's blood-curdling scream. Scared out of their wits, they rushed back to their tent. With hushed voices and tears in their eyes, survival became the primary concern. They prayed that whoever or whatever their friend had happened upon him while he was out looking for a spot to go to the bathroom, so it wouldn't know where their tent was. The plan became to sleep in shifts through the night and get back to the city at the first sign of light, and inform the officials so they could hopefully save Jacob, or whatever remained of him. Things went well for the first few shifts, so they began to relax, and hope that they would survive the night began to grow. The time came again for Steve to rest, and this time he was able to fall asleep more quickly, and sleep more deeply with his mind less on edge and the fatigue piling up. But not long later, he was roused from his sleep as Mike was rustling around the tent. Steve sat up and saw that Mike was getting his shoes on. He asked him where he was going, but Mike didn't respond or acknowledge his question. Concern growing as the grogginess faded and the situation came back to him, Steve got out of his sleeping bag and grabbed his friend by the shoulder. When he faced Mike head-on, his face was blank, but his eyes were wide and glazed over, as reflective as a mirror or as the lake. He was muttering something about needing to go, and continued getting ready to leave the tent, almost in a trance. Steve thought he was just tired, and not being careful, so he tried to talk him out of going out, saying to wait till it was light so they could pack up and hike back to the car. But Mike kept ignoring him. As Steve started to get a little more rough with Mike to try to shake him out of it, they heard a noise much the same as the one they heard before, but not nearly as far as across the lake. This was the first thing that got Mike's attention, and his whole body went tense as the flashlight reflected off his glossed eyes, and he began to rush, seeming to be in a hurry to get out of the tent and join whatever was out there. Steve went into full panic mode, unsure of what to do, but he was resolved to not let Mike go out there and be taken or killed as Jacob had. He was trying to hold Mike back, but Mike struggled against him, unshakable in his trance. Mike broke free and began to unzip the main entrance, when Steve tackled him away, pinning him down with his body weight and clamping a hand over Mike's mouth in case he tried to call the thing over. For what felt like years, Steve stayed there, barely able to breathe, resisting Mike's attempts to wriggle free or speak, sure that he hadn't come back to himself yet. Finally, as the light of morning began to work its way through the trees, Mike stopped struggling, and the mirror left his eyes. Steve asked him why he had been trying to leave, but Mike had no memory of this. In a flurry they broke down their camp, basically sprinted through the winding trail back to their car, and sped till they could get cell reception to call the police. I never asked my scout leader after the trip if he really knew a guy that claimed this stuff had really happened, or if he just made it up / come across the story from someone else telling it. But he was a smart guy, so I could see him coming up with it on the spot to make it feel real and tied to where we were camping to freak us out. I was definitely unsettled, but some of the other boys were scared out of their minds. Later that night, we were settling in to go to bed when we realized one boy had fallen asleep in the tent while we'd all been chatting. So we were cruel enough to all leave the tent and then try to wake him up and make him think we'd all been taken under the mirror's trance. He was pretty scared for about 2 minutes before someone gave it up and went and told him. But if it had been up to me, I'd have held out and let him freak out a while longer. This was an awesome question and a great thread to read and get me thinking back to this and other great camping trips. Story 15. Posted by Violet Grubbs. When I was a kid, my mom told the scariest stories. We would beg her to tell one and always regret it after. This one really stuck with me. I don't know why. It's not a campfire story, but close enough. She had taken me, my siblings, and 2 of my friends to a nearby mountain, and we had spent the whole day hiking around. When we got back to the minivan, we discovered the side door had been left open. We all laughed, didn't think much of it, and piled in. The sun was setting and my friends were begging to hear one of my mom's famous scary stories, but I was begging them not to. Eventually she relented and started telling this tale. It started by describing the very day we just had, climbing around on the mountain rocks, having a good time. But unbeknownst to us, something was crawling down the mountain toward the parking lot. She described this creature in great detail. It was human, but missing its eyes, so it had to sniff around at the leaves to search for prey. It only had arms which it used to lope and drag its heavy torso across the ground, sniffing as it went. Eventually its nose proved true and it sniffed out our car, finding the open door and pulling itself in. It dragged its body underneath the back seats where we were sitting now. At this point it was dark, and we were getting tired. My mother knew this and warned us not to fall asleep because, in the story, the creature waited, hiding under the seats, watching our legs dancing in front of it. It waited until we began drifting off, then opened his mouth, revealing long sharp teeth and biting into one of our legs. The girl it bit became petrified, sitting in the seat like a frozen zombie. It went through us one by one, while the mom in the story continued driving, assuming everyone in the back had fallen asleep. At this point, IRL, we had all pulled our legs up and were clutching our knees to our chest and sweating with panic. Eventually, in the story, the mom gets to my friend's house to drop them off. She calls out to them, and is surprised when no one answers back. Still, she assumes the kids are all sleeping. So she climbs out and opens the back door and is alarmed to find the children sitting in the back, eyes wide open, faces pale and already rotting. She tries to run and call for help, but before she can go anywhere, the thing gets her too. We were so freaking terrified. We went home the entire way curled up like that, and my legs ached so much. When we did get to my friend's house, my mom had to open the door for them so they could literally leap out of the car without once touching the floor of the inside of the car. My friends never asked her for another story after that. But sadly, that was far from the last scary story for me. Story 16. Posted by Ramport. Not my story, but my cousin's. He swears it's true, and I'm inclined to believe him. To preface, we live in the southern US, and when he was a kid there would be lots of Hispanic families who came through our small town as migrant workers. They would stay a while, taking up residence in whatever housing was available, often small empty rural houses outside of town. Then when the work dried up due to harvest season ending, or the occasional immigration bus, they'd pull out of town at a moment's notice. These houses that they'd lived in would become abandoned overnight for a few months until another family took up residence there, so forth and so on. So around Christmas time in the late 80s/early 90s, my cousin and his friends are all having a sleepover at a friend's house, during one of our rare snowstorms. This particular friend's dad was ex-military and had a pretty cool collection of surplus gear, namely, a pair of night vision goggles. My cousin and his friends were looking through these goggles at the snowfall. They said it looked incredible through the goggles, when they noticed something strange. A nearby house, which they knew to be recently abandoned, due to the family pulling their son, a classmate of my cousin, out of school and moving away, had a single light on in the attic. So as a group of teenagers tend to do, they decided to investigate. They put on all their warm clothes and walked over to the house. When they arrived, sure enough, there was light in the attic, seemingly candlelight. They were all too spooked to actually enter while someone was clearly there, and resolved to return and check it out in the daylight. The next morning they all trekked back over to the house and, not seeing any more light from the attic, made their way inside. As they expected, the house was completely cleared out. Now this is probably hyperbole, or a teenager's overactive imagination, but my cousin swears that when they pulled open the trap door to the attic, a cold wind rushed past them. As they climbed into the attic, they noticed it was just as barren as the rest of the house, save one central feature. There, in the middle of the attic, was a bloody sacrificed lamb, nailed to a crucifix. My cousin says he thinks maybe it had something to do with a weird sect of Catholicism or something, but that the scariest part to him is that they almost went into the house during whatever this ritual was. Story 17. Posted by Unknown. My dad used to tell me this one. He said he read it in a book when he was a teenager. There was once a pastor and his wife who came from the city to an old parish in a rural area. The people of the church had driven every single pastor out of the church since its founding. No one was good enough for them, and some people said they would have found fault with the angels. The pastor and his wife didn't stand a chance. They were both heavily criticized by the members. The pastor preached the Bible too much, he preached it too little. His wife dressed up too much, his wife underdressed. The pastor was greedy and wanted all their money. The wife, Alice, was a snob, and worst of all, they were from the city. They refused to pay them enough to move away, and the couple were, unfortunately, trapped there. The criticism continued and increased and became extremely malicious, until tragically Alice could take it no longer and killed herself. The very next Sunday night after the funeral, they had a business meeting. The church elders cruelly belittled the pastor for his many faults, and some even implied he was the reason his wife had died. At this final cruel criticism, there was a horrible scream, and down from the belfry came Alice shrieking accusations at the elders. She was dressed in her funeral clothes, with her hair loose, and her eyes wild and full of hatred. They all fled. The next Sunday morning, Alice again came shrieking down. Every time the church tried to meet, there would be Alice, and they were finally forced to abandon the building after a failed exorcism. To this day the church remains empty, and anyone that tries to buy or meet in it is driven off by the vengeful ghost of Alice. Side note: my dad is a pastor, and I always thought it was weird he told us this ghost story about a vengeful minister's wife. Story 18. Posted by The Big Fucking Giant. When I was a kid, I used to have a recurring character in my dreams. It was an old man with a white mustache. He usually wasn't front and center in my dreams, but at the fringes. Somebody I'd pass on the sidewalk, for example. He was always looking at me with a kind of blank stare, eyes wide open in the way people get when filled with adrenaline. He was noticeable enough that I recognized him in subsequent dreams, and would remember him sometimes when waking up from a dream with him in it. As I got older, he stopped appearing eventually. One day, when I was maybe 15 or so, and it had been a few years since I had dreamt about him, some unexpected visitors came to the house. They were family of the previous homeowners and wanted to reminisce. We let them see around the yard a bit. The woman, who was the granddaughter of the previous owners, showed me a picture of them. It was an old man with a white mustache. When we moved in the house initially, I knew that the previous owner had died of a heart attack in what became my bedroom. It scared me, but I never thought much of it really. But I always got this tingling sensation that he was still there or something. Story 19. Posted by I Don't Have to Tell You. So I'm an avid storyteller, and I know how to scare people, at least the ones I'm around, so I made this up to tell my cousins when I was younger. The story begins not long ago. In fact, not far from here either. It's a small land of mystery, fairies, goblins, giants, werewolves, and the most deadly creature of all, the Lampine. Pause for effect now. The Lampine is a tall creature. Hair as yellow as the sun and arms as dark as the cloudy night sky. It only comes out every great once in a while. In fact, it only comes out once every 42 full moons. Let confusion settle. Oh, I do believe tonight is that full moon. Maybe, maybe not. I can't remember. But that's not the story here. It began on a night like this. A bunch of children were up past their bedtime telling scary stories. The oldest, let's call him Jack, had just finished telling his Hookman story when giggling was heard behind him. The girls all shrieked and the boys jumped. Jack turned around, assuming it was one of the adults messing with them. "Come out," he said. His voice was slightly quivering. Now this was a bad thing because the Lampine loves fear. It brings it the greatest of pleasures. Cracking of twigs could be heard as a loud breathing came into their existence. Jack became terrified and slowly backed away, falling over his log. More high-pitched giggles. All of the children at this point were crying and screaming for their parents. Jack turned to run to the others, being several feet from them, when his leg was grabbed. He screamed as he was dragged back into the dark woods. They could hear him screaming in agony until a loud crunching noise stopped the screams. More giggling. The air got colder as something was thrown out of the woods. Jack's head rolled to a stop in front of them. Screams filled the woods until each and every one of their voices were silenced by a snapping and giggling. The Lampine only left behind the fear-stricken heads of the children, and their bodies were never found. At this point I would throw my voice and make giggling noises sound like they were coming from the woods. If you can't throw your voice, have someone else giggle in a really high-pitched voice and snap some twigs. Story 20. Posted by Unknown. I was lost in the woods as night was falling. I'd been walking all day and was desperate to find somewhere to shelter. In the darkness I came across a lonely cabin, and without even thinking I knocked on the door. When there was no answer, I decided to try the handle. The door was unlocked. I got in and threw myself on the single bed in the middle of the room. I felt bad about breaking in, but I was exhausted and fell asleep almost instantly. In the middle of the night, I woke up. But something kept me from going back to sleep. I hadn't noticed before, but on the wooden walls hung the most sinister paintings I'd ever seen. They were portraits. Horrible portraits of faces twisted in rage and fear, as if all the ugliness in the world was glaring down at me. Lying there in the dark, I shivered and somehow knew that the faces in the paintings were looking at me as an intruder, and how they hated me for it. Eventually my tiredness must have overcome my fear and I drifted off into the darkness of a dreamless sleep. That morning when I woke up, with the call of the forest birds flitting through the air, I opened my eyes, but I almost wished I hadn't. Because when I looked around the sagging walls, I realized that those things I'd seen the night before weren't paintings at all. They were windows. Story 21. Posted by Grey Wolf 12. I don't have any camp stories, mostly because I never camped since it's not super popular here where I live. I do, however, have some neat stories about my life that are kinda spooky. For context, I lived most of my life near a cemetery, so it might have something to do with it. The first story I always think of is that, when we first moved into the place, I was very young and shared a room with my sister, and the door was always open so the light from the hallway could be seen. I slept with a good view of the hallway. The problem is I never was someone who simply laid down and slept. I remain awake for several hours even to this day. And every night, seemingly in the clock, two shadows would walk up on the hallway towards my room. The shape wasn't from my parents, they seemed like neighbors my grandma had. But I always assumed it was my parents, and the light just made it funny, so I closed my eyes and pretended to sleep. This went on for a long time. One day I decided to get up and say hi to my parents in the hallway, so I did that when the shadows showed up. There wasn't anyone in the hallway. My neighbor and I were playing outside during the night. It was a safe place to do it, and we're using binoculars to see stuff, walking on stairs with no lights on, trying to find ghosts. We decided to go home, it was a building, and walk up the stairs again with no lights on. Halfway through I hear my name being called and my friend swears he saw eyes in the dark. He screams, I scream, we run the stairs up desperate to turn it on, as I feel something nearing us. We make the switch, lights are on, no sign of anything behind us. We look at each other, and decide to never walk up the stairs in the dark again. I never felt safe doing anything on those stairs if the lights weren't on. While growing up I got a few plushies because I always liked collecting things and plushies were no exception. Me and my friends are playing in my house with the plushies until we decide to go outside. My friends put the plushies they have on my bed, and just go. I was lagging behind so I just tossed the one in my hand and it landed sideways on my bed. I start going to the door until I decide I can't let the plushies lay sideways for some reason. When I went back, stood up, I was the last one to go out. There was no one else in the house that day besides me and my friends. My Pikachu plushie always seems suspicious after that. My girlfriend tends to wake up during the night, and although we can't say exactly if she really wakes up or is just sort of dreaming, she did tell me that, while sleeping on my bed while I was up on the living room, sometimes I was sleeping next to her, she saw a shadowy and tall figure standing on my doorway, or leaning against the desk on my room, sorta guarding her or watching her sleep. She also told me that she saw a ghostly man watching my mother sleep once when girlfriend got up to drink water and passed my mom's room. We figured the ghost man is my grandfather, mom's dad. I have no clue about the shadow guy, but he seems alright. Feel free to distort and enhance these stories for better effect and overall more spookiness. Story 22. Posted by Big Bad Zord. The guy in charge of the youth classes at my dojo as a kid had us hanging on every word. We were doing our cool-down stretches, and some kid told some lame version of a campfire story. Our instructor told us he had a friend going through a horror situation right now. He said his friend was a really good cook, so he had a chef's knife he loved, but that it was missing one day. That night the chef had a dream, where he was standing next to a man with no face, who was holding his prized knife. They were standing next to a small pond, and in the dream the man with no face took one step away from the chef, around the pond. The next day the knife was still missing, and that night the chef had the same dream, except the man with no face was now one step away, and it turned and looked at the chef, and took one more step around the pond. Every day, the knife was missing, and every night in the chef's dreams, the man with no face took one more step around the pond, at first moving further away, but eventually circling back, getting closer to the chef, with knife in hand. Every night, one more step, closer, closer. This story took like 3 fucking months to tell, because we had class on Mondays and Wednesdays, so that meant every Monday, the man with no face had taken 5 steps around the pond that we fucking lived to hear about, and every Wednesday it was another 2 steps that we needed to hear told. Finally, after weeks of this, the man with no face gets all the way around the pond, until he is finally standing right in front of the chef in the dream. The man reaches out, knife in hand, to stab the chef. The chef wakes up, and the missing knife is laying there in the bed with him. The chef takes the knife, and you know what he does. He chops vegetables, because he is a chef. We never fucking respected that instructor after that. Story 23. Posted by Unknown. Myself and a group of friends were on a hiking trip during the summer. We decided to stop for the night on the shore of a large lake. We got our tent set and a campfire started before nightfall. We had cooked dinner and were having a good time around the fire in the dark. Our group was telling stories and laughing it up when we saw a light turn on then off directly across the lake from us. We thought nothing of it and continued enjoying the night and fire. A short while later we saw the same light turn on then off. This time the light was further left from us down the opposite shoreline. Through the night we watched the light slowly get closer and closer. When the light was almost half a mile down the shoreline from us, we went off into the woods from camp. We waited a short while and watched as a group of men walked into camp with ropes and shotguns. They began to search around our campsite. One of the men was about to walk our direction into the woods when we heard laughing in the distance. The group of men left our camp without saying anything and continued down the shore from us. We waited a little while before emerging from the woods. Our group immediately packed up and began hiking in the opposite direction of where the men had gone. We decided to cut our hiking trip short and return home. I was overcome with curiosity and began researching disappearances in that area of the woods. I found a number of stories about unsolved cases where groups of campers would go missing without any trace around that lake. No bodies have ever turned up for any of the missing people. It gives me chills thinking about what could have happened if we hadn't gone into the woods. What could have happened had there not been laughter from another part of the shoreline? What became of the other people cluelessly enjoying their night? Story 24. Posted by Lord Guinea Pig. If you ever find yourself camping around the San Gabriel Mountains, you can tell this one. Years before written history, Native Americans that lived in the area told stories of the people that lived in the mountains. Men that came at dusk. I haven't heard their oral histories, and many of these things are kept hidden and secret from those that aren't members of the tribe, and even then rarely spoken of. I can tell you of the accounts I've read and of what I experienced in those hills about 6 years ago. 6 years ago around February I had just been released from Marine Corps boot camp and was spending a week with my family before heading back to Marine Combat School. Anyway, I got into a spat with my sister when I got back. She and her boyfriend had been smoking pot near my military stuff and I couldn't have it smelling like weed. They got defensive and it ended up with me out on my ass for the day. So I took a trip to the hills. Figured I can at least keep myself in shape. I get to the entrance of one of my favorite trails a little after noon. A place called Hermit Falls. An easy hike that ends with a place you can cliff jump off of into a couple of craters filled with water. The hike was nothing special. Neither was the time I spent running and jumping into the water. There's always someone there since it's pretty popular, so I spent most of my time bullshitting with locals and talking about how badass boot camp was like the brainwashed boot I was. At some point I decided I'd close my eyes and rest a bit, and that was my mistake. When I woke up, the sun had already gone behind the valley the craters made, and it cast the falls in a premature night. I immediately was wide awake thinking how screwed I was. I grabbed my bag, I had been using it as a pillow, threw on a shirt, pulled on my boots, and started back up the trail. I patted myself down as I was walking down, making sure I hadn't left anything, and looked back to give the ground a quick search when my throat caught. I'd gotten up high enough that the red of the sun over the valley was just visible. Standing in a semicircle around the falls were 5 motionless men completely shadowed by the red light behind them. Then I heard a shuffle of bushes behind me and flipped around thinking I was going to be attacked. Instead, on the other side of the river that led into the falls, was another man, still shrouded by shadow but more detailed. I could see a hat long brimmed, and he carried a walking stick in one hand. He extended a hand and beckoned, before turning and disappearing without noise into the brush. Momentarily stunned, I looked back to where the other 5 had been, but the sunlight had faded completely, and even if they'd still been there I wouldn't have been able to make them out. Then, like a pop, the sound of crickets and frogs came out of nowhere. Like they'd always been there, but the noise had been suppressed. I ran back to my car and went home and didn't talk about it until a few years after that, when a buddy of mine mentioned the shadow people. I told him and we looked into it together. Found articles and articles on them. They show up all over the country. But the one with the walking stick, has been sighted multiple times in the mountains in California. There's a lot of lore around him, and most of it is Native American, though I can't remember the tribe or tribes. If you take the time to look into it, you'll see what I mean. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened had I followed him. Most of the time I try not to think about it. Story 25. Posted by Abu Zaria. So, I don't even remember where I heard this story, but it has been my favorite for a long time. Also, English is not my first language, so sorry for grammar and vocabulary and all that stuff. It is said that, during the Second World War, a lot of crimes took place in what is currently Albania. Lots of people had to escape from their homes in the forests, which are big and deep in that area, and so a lot of simple wooden cabins were built in order to try to keep themselves safe. Those cabins are nowadays abandoned, as they were assembled in a hurry, and were not prepared for a long time living. This story took place not that long ago, maybe 15 or 20 years. An experienced lonely hunter was spending some time in one of those forests, but the day was not going quite well, as he had not managed to hunt anything. The sun was starting to go down, and in not much time it would be all completely dark and he wouldn't be able to find its way back, even experienced as he was. But he was frustrated, for it was the 3rd day in a row that he would have to leave empty-handed. He continued walking while thinking about what to do, when, suddenly, he stepped across one of those wooden cottages made during the Two World War that he knew of very well. Most of the time they were empty and abandoned, cold places where only some animals or people who had nothing else would have wanted to stay. But this one seemed different, clean and tidy, even under the poor light that was coming from the sun already. He thought that maybe it was the home of someone, and that if he could spend the night there, he would have like 1 or 2 hours more to try to hunt something. When he was about to knock on the door, he found out it was open. And the inside was unbelievable. Not only did it have a fireplace with prepared wood, but also a sofa, chairs, and a table. He even found a room with a clothed bed. Excited about his incredible discovery, he lit the fireplace so the house warmed up while he used the hour or two he had unexpectedly gained. Exactly 2.5 hours later, he came back, still empty-handed, but happy that, at least, was going to be able to pass the night warm and in a seemingly safe place. The fireplace had done its job, and the house was heated. It also brought more light to the place, so he got a wider view of where he was. He saw the chairs, the table, the sofa. And then he spotted the paintings. The walls were filled with paintings. Ultra-realistic, horrifying pictures. Chills ran down his spine. There was one that represented a man hanging in a dark chamber. Other, a pile of what he assumed were dead bodies, rotting in a forest. The worst, by far, was a sofa with 3 little kids, dressed like dolls, mummified. The realism was nearly astonishing. He didn't even dare to look at them closely. He took his rifle and headed to the bedroom, asking himself what kind of weirdo painted those pictures and in the name of which god he had to end up in a place like that. Even in the room there was another horrible picture, a lonely, flimsy man, with pale skin, hideous, creepy yellow eyes looking directly to him, and its mouth disgustingly sewed. He covered in the bed as fast as he could, hugging its riffle, shaking and cursing whoever had that awful taste of art. It took a long time for him to fall asleep, but in the process, he didn't open his eyes not even once. I would like to tell you that something horrifying happened that night, something that would traumatize all the ones that hear this story. But I'd be lying. The truth is that early in the morning the following day, the haunter opened his eyes, all the room filled with the morning sunlight. Still a little bit frightened, he took his rifle, walked away from that creepy place, and returned home. I don't know if he lived a long, happy life. I don't know if he went back to that forest, even to that same cabin. But what I do know is that that morning, when he woke up, he noticed something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. There were no paintings in the cabin, just windows. Story 26. Posted by Evil Noob Hacker. This is the story of the Buzzard Brothers, one that we've told every year, at the rocks where they lived. It's right after the Civil War in America. The Buzzards lived in the average mining town of Colebrook, PA, named after the man who'd essentially monopolized the town, Mr. Coleman. Now, the Buzzards were an average family. The father worked in the mines that Mr. Coleman owned, while the mother took care of their 3 sons, the 14-year-old John, the 12-year-old James, and the 8-year-old Alex. All of the boys were joyful little ones, and loved playing on the massive boulders outside their home. However, during this time, tragedy struck. While the miners were going at it, working all day, one of the mine shafts collapsed, with Mr. Buzzard and a few others inside. Now, normal protocol is to stop all work and mine them out. However, this would cost Mr. Coleman lots of money. You see, Mr. Coleman had 2 odd quirks. The first was that he was obsessed with money. The second was that he was immensely paranoid. So he ordered his miners to keep working, and covered up the mine shaft. However, the miners continued to work after hours on opening up the collapse. However, they were a day too late when they got into them. They were already dead, dehydrated, and starved. This was awful news to the Buzzard family, as the Buzzards both lived with their father dearly, and needed him to survive. So the mother took up the breadwinner role as a seamstress, also owned by Mr. Coleman, while the boys took up the role of the house cleaners. Now, the issue about seamstress factories is that everyone's really tightly knit, so there's no real way to prevent sickness from running around. Mrs. Buzzard eventually caught a sickness, and fell to influenza about 4 months after her husband. Now the Buzzard brothers were parentless, and absolutely distraught. Since none of them were old enough to work, they had to go into town and steal. While they weren't very good, The town knew what happened to their parents, and were kind to them, turning a blind eye so they could live.